There have been some social forces that have stimulated a renewed national debate over cooperation and conflict among people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. They include the civil rights movement, the ethnic diversity of the third great immigrant stream, and recent events such as the tragic deaths of Trayvon Martin and the Michael Brown case have pushed the future of ethnicity to the forefront. Chapter 14 has further reflections on assimilation and ethnicity, consequences of colonialization and immigration, an alternate view, some applications of the alternate view, some tentative conclusions about racial and ethnic relations in the United States, the future of ethnicity in the United States and across national boundaries. The authors have found that several groups did not undergo the three-generation process. In fact, very few American groups have reached full Anglo-conformity assimilation in the expected period of time. They even state that the colonial Scotch-Irish and Germans did not undergo complete primary and marital assimilations within 3 generations. What may survive is a new form of ethnicity referred to by the authors as symbolic ethnicity. It assists people in enjoying a sense of community as well as expressing their uniqueness. Looking back in time, the Scotch-Irish and Germans presented a high level of merger between the Anglo core. Full Anglo-conformity of the northwestern white European group in America possibly will occur in less than 200 years, even less than 150 years. Their experience extends the three-generation idea to as many as 6 or 8 generations. It gives evidence that Anglo-conformity merger does occur in some groups. For those that formed the first immigrant stream, many of the descendants have been in the country for as long as 6 generations, and very few have been here in less than 3. There is reason to believe that with the passage of time, they will move toward higher levels of Anglo-conformity. An example that has been noticed is that many Native Americans prefer a pan-Indian identity, and many Mexican Americans prefer the pan-ethnic terms Hispanic or Latino. For those that formed the second stream immigrants, the Italians, did not seem to be good prospects for Anglo-conformity assimilation. Due to their circumstances, poor, illiterate, unskilled, and the high levels of discrimination they encountered, all combined to help them preserve their distinctiveness as an ethnic group. When we took into consideration age, sex, education, occupation, and the part of the country they lived in, Italian Americans seemed to be very similar to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The author of the book How the Irish Became White, Ignatieff, described the Irish became part of the oppressing white race in America. They simply distanced themselves from blacks, and they joined white labor unions that barred blacks from supporting political parties that favored whites. The concept of race is not fixed by nature, as we have learned in our text and over time. We know that it can be socially constructed, and over time in the United States, the meaning of the term white and being classified as white has changed over time and is negotiated. In 1922, the Supreme Court ruled that Ozawa could not become a U.S. citizen because he was not white. The court conceded that skin color alone could not be the determining measure because many non-white people have skins of a lighter color than many whites. Then, in the 1930 census, Mexicans were classified as a separate non-white Mexican race. Whites rarely think about having a white ethnic identity. Most white people do not talk much about racism or their own racial identity. They don't recognize the existence of institutional discrimination, and many may feel personally threatened by the mention of racism. Many have benefited economically and socially by just being a member of the white race and subscribe to the racist ideas and engage in subtle acts. This is called laissez-faire racism, the importance of the status of being white in American society and to rationalize their own opposition to social change in ways that may contribute to the continuation of racial oppression. This term can be applied to other non-white groups. The highest rates of outmarriages, it seems that most people are descended from several ethnic backgrounds. The U.S. Census of 2000 allowed multiracial categories for enumeration. Consequently, as Americans choose more than one identity, assimilation becomes very complex. Now you don't have to give up your other identities. It seems that even though 3 generations may be long enough to allow a high degree of cultural and secondary assimilation between the white European groups, the remaining forms of assimilation might take much longer. The assumption that the second immigration streams are moving toward Anglo-conformity should mean that they become less individual as time goes on. The expectation is for a continued prominence of white ethnicity in American life for at least 1 or 2 or more generations, and a continued or growing acceptance of cultural pluralism as the principal view of the way immigrants and their descendants should be Americanized. In other words, how they interact with each other. At first, relationships between the dominant group and a colonialized group set up a pattern that did not lead toward Anglo-conformity. Instead, the minority tried to end colonialization by establishment of a separate nation. The dominant group prefers that the colonialized minority leave the country or assimilate culturally while staying apart and inferior in all other ways. The non-white groups have faced distinctive and weird dilemmas of their own. When an extensive investigation is compared between blacks and second-stream immigrants, they found that the experience of blacks was worse. Blacks in the northern cities have not yet been there more than 3 generations, and although they have met less favorable circumstances and more discrimination than other immigrants, their future may resemble those of ethnic whites. The immigrant model doesn't reject the colonial model of the experiences of the non-whites in America. Since the histories of blacks, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Japanese, and Indian Americans contain specific components that justify either the colonial or immigrant view, the authors conclude that both views are correct, and they consider an alternate view to help place the facts of conquest and assimilation for the different perspectives. The original contacts between groups are very important in understanding the later course of their relations. First, a conquered minority is likely to be hostile for a long period of time and to have separatist and secessionist tendencies. Second, the immigrant minority is likely to exhibit hostility for a shorter period of time and prefer some form of assimilation. The alternate view that the authors consider emphasizes some differences in the social characteristics of colonized and immigrant minorities during the early stages of their formations, that the basic generalizations refer to probabilities rather than to certainties, and that assimilation processes include a dynamic merger of elements found in the immigrant and colonial models. Let us consider the Mexican Americans, the Puerto Ricans, and the Native Americans. The Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans did not depend on the white Anglo society or other institutions for any of their needs. They didn't even immigrate to America. For the Mexicans, the border crossed them. Consequently, their initial relationship to Anglo-American society was centrifugal, the type of relationship that is usually formed between a conquered group and the conquering group. The closeness of both Mexico and Puerto Rico to the United States and the persistence of discrimination against people of their origins are forces that support the possibility that both these groups will give up on assimilationist goals. For the Native Americans, they were clearly conquered, and you can clearly see the formation of a centrifugal relationship. Native Americans continue to struggle toward being admitted into American society on equal footing with other citizens while trying to maintain their traditions and their culture. Unless the citizens of these groups are allowed to advance in the dominant culture when it comes to income, education, jobs, healthcare, housing, etc., there is every reason to believe that these groups will remain distinctive ethnic groups within American life for many more generations. Now let us consider the African Americans. They were a colonized minority. However, they did not form a centrifugal relationship with the Anglo-dominant group. As slaves, they were heavily dependent on the host society. African Americans have been able to create their own institutions in the United States. It has been a slow process and much effort has been put forth. In any event, African Americans will continue to be a distinctive group within American society for many additional generations, according to the authors. For the African Americans, slow progress in achieving their education, gaining better jobs, living in better housing, and getting representation in the U.S. government only reinforces the separatist perspective. Many have doubts about the goals of assimilation. A June 7, 1999 Newsweek survey found that black income was at its highest level ever, and unemployment among blacks was lower than it had been in a quarter of a century. Yet, many successful African Americans still felt that it was impossible to feel truly accepted in America. Here are some tentative conclusions. Many people coming to America want to assimilate and better their living circumstances. In today's society, assimilation is likely to take different forms. However, one does not need to lose their ethnic traditions or culture to assimilate. We know that there is some support within both whites and non-white groups for separatism. The strongest support comes from among whites. Many whites want blacks to be kept out of their neighborhoods, and they feel that they have the right to keep them out. There is still a sizable segment of the U.S. population that do not want their children to go to school with black children, do not want to be led by black leaders, and do not want their relatives to be married to a black person. We have seen that even today when President Obama's citizenship was questioned by a core Republican group that has not let it go, insisting that his birth certificate is not real. In the 1990s, there was white separatist propaganda to establish an Aryan homeland. History has shown that discrimination has taken place against pretty much every single group in the United States, especially against minorities. The courts have declared these acts unlawful and against the principles of what America stands for, equality for all. Many groups have undergone a high degree of cultural and secondary assimilation within 3 generations. Third and succeeding generations frequently have a renewed interest in revitalizing their ethnic heritages. Continued existence of racial and ethnic minority groups sometimes causes a problem for national unity. However, these groups support a sense of individual and social purpose for scores of Americans. The most pressing problem of maintaining high levels of social cultural distinctiveness is the failure to provide equal opportunities for secondary assimilation to every American who wants them. A big challenge is to increase opportunities for individuals to leave the ethnic community or stay within it if they want. This outcome demands getting rid of the current racism that exists today. We know that the United States is not alone in the struggle to integrate different racial and ethnic groups. Serious tensions exist in many countries. South Africa, for decades, kept the black majority under a legal system called apartheid. Today, the black majority controls the South African government. Nelson Mandela was instrumental in dismantling that system of oppression. He led the African National Congress and eventually was elected president of South Africa. The country is experiencing challenges of this multiracial society. They are having to make up for many years of extensive injustice under apartheid. They are also having to deal with the flood of undocumented immigrants. Under President Mandela's government, restrictions were eased because many of the neighboring countries supported their anti-apartheid struggles. Many of those coming into South Africa are impoverished immigrants. Now both blacks and whites are showing signs of xenophobia. The other countries I will focus on is Brazil. They are similar in size to the United States and also experience a history of slavery. However, in Brazil, during the colonial era, much of the population was both colored and slaves, and there was never a systematic separation of races. Thus, there was much more intermarriage between whites and blacks. Even though Brazil denies the existence of racism, in 1989, the U.S. Department found that blacks and mulattoes in Brazil received less income and education than whites and encountered discrimination in housing and other services. The Brazilian experience suggests that prejudice and discrimination do not just disappear as a consequence of intergroup associations. The privileged classes are largely of European background and/or of light skin-colored people than the less affluent classes. Either way, both Brazil and the United States continue to show inconsistencies between everyday social life actions and the doctrine of democracy. Let us take a look at Kosovo. Here is a powerful example of failure when it comes to ethnic inclusion. The Albanians made up 90% of Kosovo, and many of them were Muslim. They lived pretty much separate socially and carried out their everyday livelihood entirely within their own ethnic groups. In 1989, under the direction of President Milosevic, they began attacking Albanians. The Serbs expelled Albanian teachers and professors from schools and the universities. They soon expelled them from hospitals to factories. In 1998, the Serbs destroyed Albanian villages, murdered civilians, and drove hundreds of thousands of Albanian people into the mountains. NATO troops had to step in and stop the violence to eventually return Albanian refugees to their homes. Even so, violence continued to blow up between these groups due to the hatred on both sides. Just because groups learn to associate and mingle over time will not ensure equality of treatment or of opportunity. Racial and ethnic differences have not dispersed anywhere. They seem to have become more noticeable. Our current generation and those to come need to learn to recognize the crazy basis of their own stereotypes and the injustices of racism. One only needs to take a look at the recent events of Ferguson, Missouri. People are beginning to take action. We see that today with the protests, not just in Ferguson, but throughout the nation. Degler states it well at the end of chapter 14. We have to recognize that the price of equality in pluralism, like the price of liberty, is eternal vigilance. I want to say to all of you, be vigilant when you see acts of discrimination. Speak up and don't allow them to happen. Thank you for taking this class, and I truly hope you learned from our history so that we do not repeat our mistakes from the past.